In the northwest corner of Wales, where the mountains of Snowdonia fold down into green farmland, there is a valley that most maps no longer bother to name. Today, it holds a body of water 4 miles long, ringed by conifer plantations, quiet enough that walkers rarely stop for more than a photograph. But before 1965, this valley had a name of its own, Cwm Tryweryn, and inside it, tucked against the river Tryweryn itself, sat a hamlet called Capel Celyn. It was never a large place. 12 farmhouses, a school with a single classroom, a post office, a cemetery, and at its heart, a Welsh Methodist chapel built in 1820, rebuilt in 1888, the kind of modest stone building that exists in 1,000 Welsh valleys, and yet, in this one, held an entire community together for over a century. The land here is unforgiving in the way that shapes people rather than breaks them. Steep-sided, wet for 2/3 of the year, better suited to sheep than to ambition. The families who farmed it were not wealthy, but they were rooted. Many of the same names appear in the parish registers for 5, 6, 7 generations. This was one of the last strongholds in Wales where Welsh was not a second language revived for tourists or ceremony. It was simply the language people were born speaking, argued in, prayed in, and buried under. To understand what was lost here, you first have to understand what made it worth keeping. Not spectacle, not grandeur, just an unbroken thread. A community that had barely changed in shape or rhythm since before the industrial world outside. It had a name for progress. Every day in Capel Celyn began the same way it had for 100 years. Farmers rose before light to walk the hillsides, checking on sheep scattered across land that had no fences to speak of, only memory. The invisible boundaries passed down from father to son, drawn not on paper, but on the shape of the land itself. The school held perhaps a dozen children at any one time, all ages taught together in one whitewashed room. Lessons conducted almost entirely in Welsh. The post office doubled as the only shop for miles. And on Sundays, the entire valley converged on the chapel, not out of obligation, but because in a community this small, worship was also the only regular occasion when everyone was in the same room at once. News was shared there. Marriages were arranged there. Grief was carried there. Winters were long, and the work was hard. But the people of Tryweryn had built something that outside observers, when they finally paid attention, would later struggle to put into words. A kind of self-sufficiency that had nothing to do with isolation and everything to do with interdependence. Every family relied on every other. Every voice in the chapel choir mattered because there weren't enough voices to spare. It is worth sitting with this ordinariness for a moment, because what happened next did not happen to a symbol or a statistic or a footnote in a planning document. It happened to a school run, a Sunday service, a walk up the hillside to check on the lambs. It happened to people who had no reason, in 1955, to think any of it would end. In 1955, Liverpool City Council was searching for a new source of water for a rapidly growing industrial population. Their engineers identified the Tryweryn Valley as ideal, a naturally deep, narrow gorge that would flood easily behind a dam, yielding a reservoir large enough to supply the city for generations. There was, however, a village in the way. Under normal planning law, a project of this scale in Wales would have required consultation with Welsh local authorities. Liverpool's solution was procedural rather than diplomatic. Rather than seek planning permission through the usual channels, the council promoted a private act of parliament, a mechanism that, if passed, would let them bypass Welsh consent entirely. At first, it was treated as a formality, a line item in a council report 300 miles from the valley it would erase. But when word reached Capel Celyn, the response was not despair. It was resistance, and it would become one of the most consequential protests in modern Welsh history. Every single Welsh member of Parliament voted against the bill, 35 in total, across every party. It made no difference. In July 1957, the Tryweryn Valley Water Bill passed through Westminster and received royal assent. Liverpool City Council now had the legal right to flood the valley, and no Welsh authority, no local objection, and no unanimous parliamentary vote against it could stop them. For the 12 families of Capel Celyn, a decision made entirely by people who would never live with its consequences had just determined the end of everything they knew. Because of that vote, surveyors arrived in the valley within months, driving marker stakes into fields that had been farmed by the same families for generations. Because of that vote, compulsory purchase orders followed, legal notices informing each household that their home, their land, and the graves of their ancestors would be required by a date not of their choosing. What followed was not quiet acceptance. Tryweryn became a rallying point that reached far beyond the valley itself. Protesters travelled from across Wales. Welsh students in London demonstrated outside Liverpool's offices. In 1963, 2 men attempted to sabotage the construction site with explosives, an act of protest that, while unsuccessful, signaled how deeply the flooding had come to symbolize something larger than one reservoir. The sense that Wales had no meaningful say in decisions made about its own land. But protest, however determined, could not stop machinery already in motion. Because of that vote, one by one, the 12 families began to leave. Furniture was loaded onto trucks. Livestock was sold or relocated to unfamiliar hillsides. Because of that vote, the graves in the Capel Cemetery, 69 of them, had to be exhumed and reinterred at a new burial ground built specifically to receive them. The school teacher gave her final lesson to a classroom that grew emptier by the week. Neighbors who had lived within shouting distance of each other for their entire lives, scattered to different towns, different countries, in some cases, different continents. The interdependence that had defined the valley dissolving, not gradually, but on a schedule set by engineers. And in the local archive in Bala, a document survives from those final months. A short, handwritten note left by one of the last residents before the water rose. Historians still debate exactly what she meant by it, but read alongside everything that came after, it reads, less like a farewell and more like a warning. By late 1964, only the chapel itself remained standing, its pews empty, its doors still functioning on their hinges, even as the valley around it emptied. The flooding became and remains one of the most cited moments in the modern Welsh devolution movement. None of that, however, could return a single farmhouse or unerase a single field boundary. On the 28th of September, 1965, Capel Celyn Chapel held its final service. What had once been a weekly gathering of an entire valley became that day something closer to a vigil, a congregation assembled not to celebrate anything, but to mark, formally and together, the end of a place that had shaped every one of them. Later that same year, the floodgates were closed, and the River Tryweryn, once a modest stream running past 12 farmhouses and a schoolhouse, began to rise. It rose slowly enough that, for weeks, the valley looked almost unchanged from a distance. Fields still visible, stone walls still standing, the chapel roof still catching the afternoon light. And then, gradually, it did not. The official opening of Llyn Celyn Reservoir took place on the 21st of October, 1965. Liverpool City Council held a ceremony to mark the occasion. Protesters disrupted the public address system before officials could finish speaking. A final, symbolic act of defiance from a fight that had already, in every practical sense, been lost. There was no dramatic collapse, no single dramatic image of a village swallowed in an instant. Only a slow, administrative erasure. A valley disappearing not because the earth demanded it, but because a distant city's engineers had calculated correctly that this was the most efficient place to put a reservoir. And since that day, Llyn Celyn has sat quietly in its valley, indistinguishable to most visitors from any of the dozens of reservoirs scattered across the Welsh uplands. Conifer plantations now line its banks. A small visitor car park sits near the dam wall. Few of the walkers who pass through in summer know that the water beneath them once had streets and names and a school run at 9 o'clock every weekday morning. But the valley has not entirely given up its shape. In periods of severe drought, water levels have dropped low enough to expose the outline of an old road, the remains of a stone bridge, even sections of wall from the farmhouses that once stood along the valley floor. When this happens, it draws visitors specifically to see it. People standing at the water's edge, photographing stonework that has spent most of the last 60 years entirely submerged. On the shore near the dam, a small memorial marks what was lost, the original chapel gates, preserved and re-erected. Perhaps the most enduring monument, though, isn't at Llyn Celyn at all. On a wall beside the A487 road, roughly 70 miles south, two words have been painted and repainted for over half a century: Capel Celyn. Remember Tryweryn? There is something particular about a place lost to water rather than to time. A ruin left to decay in open air erodes gradually, giving onlookers the chance to watch a memory fade in stages. A flooded village disappears all at once and then waits, intact, more or less, beneath a surface that gives almost nothing away. Capel Celyn is still down there. The foundations of the school, the lines of field walls. A community preserved not by choice, but by circumstance, sealed beneath water that most people driving past will only ever know as scenery. Every so often, when the rain fails and the reservoir drops, the valley resurfaces just long enough to remind whoever is standing there that convenience always has to come from somewhere. A tap turned on in a city kitchen 70 miles away still traces back to this valley. If you find meaning in these forgotten coordinates, consider subscribing to the map. Together, we'll keep rescuing these places from the silence of history. Sleep well.